Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Semiconductors are viewed as the new oil. Taiwan's leadership position in the semiconductor sector raises questions given its security vulnerability and its relationship with China. The U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, passed in 2022, is the first of its kind in recent years, where the U.S. government aims to strengthen the U.S. industrial capabilities on the grounds of national and economic security. Now, today's guest is John Neuffer, CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA. SIA advances policies to help U.S. semiconductor companies in design, manufacturing, and research. Welcome, John.
Great to be here. Pleasure.
Well, SIA has been around since 1977. The competition for semiconductor leadership started way back in the 50s, according to Chris Miller's book, The Chip War. So why is chip manufacturing so important to the United States, and how did the US lose the edge in the last few decades?
Okay, well, we've all come to know that semiconductors are powering our lives now. They keep us safe in automobiles. They keep pacemakers going. They keep the lights on in our house, in our homes. They keep us connected socially. They keep our defense systems up and running. In fact, just about everything with an electric current flowing through it now has semiconductors involved. This all came into bold relief during the pandemic and the chip shortages that ensued. So it should come as no surprise that everyone around the world started to focus on where these incredibly significant chips are made. In the US, we woke up to the reality that while we produced 37% of the world's chips in 1990, that's down to about 10% now. So yes, we did lose our edge when it comes to our share of global manufacturing of chips. And the CHIPS Act, and we could talk about this a little bit more later, is intended to fix that. To level the playing field, the U.S. government is now doing what other governments have been doing for decades to attract chip manufacturing to their shores, and that is providing significant incentives in the form of grants and tax breaks. But it's important to remember, it's important to remember the U.S. has never lost its edge in semiconductor R&D and design, and the manufacturing of the sophisticated tools that makes chips. And also U.S.-based companies still command roughly half of the global semiconductor market share. So I should also add that the CHIPS Act is working, and as we see TSMC and many other global and U.S. companies moving to build fabs in the U.S.
Yeah, I think the importance of chips is of no question, especially I would say more recently, in addition to manufacturing, obviously, the global supply chain, etc., is that the more recent development of advanced technologies, especially AI, it requires a lot more advanced design and manufacturing. So we see that many AI companies are now starting to think about producing their own chips on the US soil. So there seems to be a new wave of demand for advanced chips, both out of the national security concerns as well as the demand just to power advanced technology. So do you think this surge of demand is more sustainable for the longer term, or just another cycle that ebbs and flows? Because we've seen this demand of chips sort of up and down.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So our industry has been notoriously cyclical throughout the years. So that's just always going to be that we're going to have ups and downs into the future. But the long-term trajectory of the industry is very positive due to ever-increasing prevalence of chips in everyday products, and the role chips are giving rise to new transformative technologies. And one thing important about the AI chips in particular, they're incredibly powerful in and of themselves, but the AI chips also are surrounded in products by all sorts of other chip technologies like memory and analog. So AI chips, demand for AI chips is growing, and so is all these other chips that are around those AI chips that make them work. But in terms of the emerging technologies that are going to power chip demand going forward, it's not just AI. It's also IoT. It's 6G. It's autonomous driving. So I think when you look over the horizon, it's a for the long term, it's a very positive story when you're looking at demand for our technologies.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting to see, this surge of interest almost, as a relative surprise to people who aren't versed in the history and this industry. And, we also saw the Chips and Science Act that was passed in 2022 is touted by the Biden administration as a major success. That hopes to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, to incentivize R&D, and to strengthen the American workforce. But in the meantime, they also put on guardrails like export controls, restricting American companies from doing business with Chinese or Russian companies. I would say with the Chinese markets in particular, because it's so large, and for a lot of semiconductor companies, it's their major market. So, there are sort of grumblings about this may hurt American company business. And therefore, there are questions about the effectiveness of such an industrial policy approach to US chip production. And what is your view of that? Is this generally going to make American companies more or less competitive in the long run?
Well, listen, let me talk about the chip side of this story. And we're feeling very positive about the trajectory of the CHIPS Act. As I've suggested, the CHIPS Act is off to a very good start, and will begin to reverse a decades-long slide in our share of chip manufacturing. The early returns show that nearly $500 billion in commitments by the private sector are in play. That's 80 projects over
more than government subsidies or incentives.
That's on top of the government subsidies. That's exactly right, and it's gonna create hundreds of thousands of jobs. So I think the early indications are that we're off to a really good start. I should also say, and you mentioned this in your question, was that packed into the CHIPS Act is also something like $12 billion of investments in R&D. But I will say that we believe it's critical to ensure we don't undo the benefits of the CHIPS Act by unduly limiting U.S. companies' access to global markets. But when it comes to involving national security, when national security comes into play, it's really out of our hands in the private sector. That's really up to the governments, and we have to roll with it.
Well, I think there are many questions about that, right? When the government says it's national security, how far do you go and where do you draw the lines? But, I want to come to, specifically about a few companies, especially TSMC, that's very relevant to Taiwan. We see that, to regain American chip production capabilities, ensuring TSMC and Samsung investments seems important, and both are your members, international members. TSMC especially is in news headlines all the time because it produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips and is headquartered in Taiwan, where it's been portrayed as this like geopolitical tension hotspot. But many worry, especially those in Taiwan, that TSMC will lose its edge. And some recent reporting has shown that there's difficulty of TSMC operating in Arizona due to different company cultures and workforces, etc. There's also reporting that TSMC will have to charge more for chips that are not manufactured in Taiwan. I mean, from your point of view, it's your member as well. Is this good for TSMC?
So just first of all, we represent the whole industry, so don't comment on pricing strategies, things like that for individual companies. I think you'd understand that. But I'll also say we're encouraged by TSMC's and Samsung's decisions to make significant investments in the U.S. We're very happy about that. We, as the CHIPS Act was coming together, we made a point of ensuring that the CHIPS Act benefits would fall to not just U.S. companies, but the foreign players as well. Foreign players are incredibly innovative, and they should be a big part of our ecosystem here in the U.S. I can also say that by some estimates, our $530 billion industry today is projected to grow to $1 trillion by 2030. That's because chips are becoming so ubiquitous.
Hmm.
The point here is that the pie is getting bigger in our industry. So the pieces of the pie are also getting significantly bigger, which means there'll be more for the US, more for Taiwan to go around. So I
Yeah.
think we all stand to gain by this.
Yeah, so instead of looking at shrinking the pie, you're basically saying the pie is going to be much bigger. So for TSMC or other companies to diversify their investment is also good for the long run.
Yeah, and I'll just add that coming out of the pandemic, I think one of the kind of singular lessons for all of us was that diversification of supply chains is absolutely essential, whether
Yes.
you're based in Taiwan or you're based in the US.
Yeah, it's a risk management, basically.
Exactly.
And we see that the US has been, exerting pressure on other countries too, right? Japan, South Korea, and Netherlands to actually adopt export controls to China and Russia. And we've seen companies kind of complaining about this openly, and say these restrictions will only help China accelerate its own domestic semiconductor capabilities. For example, when Huawei, if you remember a couple months ago, the latest phone at that time uses an advanced chip produced by SMIC, which is a Chinese semiconductor manufacturing company, kind of took the world by surprise. So what is your view on, just generally speaking, this kind of export control, trying to, I use my word, kneecap China's, or slow down China's semiconductor capabilities?
So it should come as no surprise that SIN or member companies, of course, recognize the need to protect national security. And maintaining a healthy U.S. semiconductor industry is an essential component to achieving that goal. This is the balancing act our government considers for U.S. industry, and what I assume other governments are weighing for their industry, their chip industries. So we've long underscored the importance of implementing export controls in a multilateral manner, so they don't undermine innovation and the technology base in the United States. We've shared this message directly with the U.S. government and with other governments. We also emphasize to our government to take into account that if there are foreign alternatives available in the global market, not subject to export controls, then the controls will not achieve their national security objective. If
And
our
so I
right,
have to dig deeper on this. Are
jump in.
there alternatives?
Say that again.
Are there alternatives
Yeah,
to?
well, it depends on the product. Well, our industry is our market is huge. The kinds of products we have are tens of hundreds of thousands of products, and in many cases there are alternatives. So if our products are merely designed out and replaced with products of our competitors, then that seems like folly to us. If the U.S. government moves forward with export controls, it needs to take in this foreign availability factor.
Well, the big enforcer of the CHIPS Act and advocate, for the U.S. government has been the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, and she a few days ago said the export controls have been effective. And she said it in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine. She said, quote unquote, it's absolutely the case that our export controls have hurt their ability to conduct the war, made it harder. She also said China's chips are still years behind the US. So it sounds like the Biden administration's policies have been a success just overall. The famed author Chris Miller, who was on our program as well, also proclaimed that this has been a huge success. Would you say you agree with this assessment?
Well, I am not a national security expert, and I will leave it up to them to make that assessment, the experts in the think tank world and in government. But I will say the critical thing that happened in the U.S. was a pivot towards not just looking at kind of the defensive strategies like export controls, but doubling down on an affirmative agenda and doing things to help our industry pedal faster. And that manifested in this historic CHIPS Act, which has tens of billions in grants and tax incentives to build on U.S. shores. And there's major investments in R&D for our sector. So this has been absolutely critical for going forward in terms of policy. It's been a very helpful development for us that we have a strong affirmative agenda here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you work with so many AI chips related companies, I'm just curious, for companies like NVIDIA, AMD, etc., I assume they all welcome CHIPS Act, but in private, to the extent that you can share, what would they like to see more done at the policy level?
Great question, and I assume this is not in private, but I will give you a public answer, which syncs up with my private answer, which is, listen, the CHIPS Act did a lot to advance the manufacturing here in the U.S. But a big part of our industry and a part of our industry we've dominated in the U.S. is design. And we also think that there should be a focus on ensuring that R&D, chip R&D, stays here strong in the U.S. and we don't kind of get behind the eight ball like we did with manufacturing, stay in front of the problem and incentivize our R&D development here in the U.S.
Well, we've talked a lot about American semiconductor industry. I mean, since you represent SIA, which is, the mission is really for US industry. While the US kind of ensures, all these capabilities, a good thing for the US, but we also see that it's encouraging friendshoring in countries like India, Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries to diversify the supply chain. And what does this all mean to the future of the global semiconductor industry? And the reason why I ask is because, Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, famously said the globalization is dead. It may be a bit dramatic, but, what does this mean for the future of semiconductor industry?
Well, you throw a lot out there. First of all, while U.S. industry priorities are a big priority for SIA, we also have lots of global companies, and they're a priority for us as well. We are a global industry, and that's reflected in our membership. But good question about.
Just curious, are there any equivalent in other countries? This industry association?
There are. There's an SIA in Taiwan. There's an SIA in Korea, in Japan, in Europe, and in China. And we actually get together on a fairly regular basis and in a forum called the World Semiconductor Council. But I diverge. So, but the reality is. The CHIPS Act is incentivizing, it's fixing a problem in the U.S., which is our manufacturing has slipped overseas over the decades. But everybody here who's kind of in the know, including Secretary Raimondo and other senior U.S. government officials, have repeatedly acknowledged that the U.S. can't go it alone. We will always be a global industry, and we will rely on our friends, partners, and allies around the world. So the CHIPS Act is one side of the coin, which is incentivizing manufacturing here in the U.S. The other side of the coin is helping our friends and partners have stronger, more resilient supply chains, because that's very important for us here in the U.S. So we've done a lot of work around the world as an industry and as an association to try to help these countries strengthen their supply chain. So that should really come as no surprise. And the idea that globalization is dead, I wouldn't totally agree with that. I think certainly some of the thinking around global trade is certainly being challenged, and the thinking around globalization is being challenged. But for our industry, we're just so embedded in the global supply chains that I just don't see that coming apart in a significant way. Our industry is wildly successful for two reasons. One is we invest in the U.S. about 20% of our sales back into R&D. We're incredibly R&D intensive. But the other thing is we've been able to build these supply chains around the world, and they've helped us become incredibly efficient and incredibly innovative. And if either of those components, our ability to invest in R&D, which is driven by our sales, or if our ability to tap into the global supply chains were somehow diminished, our strength and our competitiveness as an industry would be seriously challenged.
So it sounds like it's really not just about rebuilding U.S. semiconductor industry, but it sounds more to me is a rejiggering sort of the global supply chain, because in the past, the world as one, the U.S. is much more dependent, or doesn't raise question about, being very dependent on China. But these days, obviously, out of national security concerns, the U.S. still wants to have a global supply chain, but perhaps, in the lands of, countries where probably the U.S. trusts more. Is that a better explanation?
Coming off the pandemic, we all saw very clearly that 75% of all chips are manufactured in East Asia. And that's just probably an overconcentration of manufacturing. So our thinking, the U.S. government's thinking is, well, we just need to have some more manufacturing here. Not all of it, but we need to balance things out and rebalance the supply chains to mitigate risk. You're never going to eliminate risk. That's not how this works, but you can reduce risk. And so there just needs to be rebalancing, kind of a spreading the peanut butter out more broadly, so that we're all safer against future global disruptions like pandemics, material shortages, geopolitical conflicts, and natural disasters.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John, for shedding light on the development of semiconductor industry. It'll continue to be a focus for Taiwan for sure. So thank you. We hope to have you back in the future.
Well, Taiwan is an incredibly important part of our supply chain. Your companies are incredibly important to us, and it's been a great pleasure to spend some time with you to talk about all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, and take care.
Thank you.